When we invited Lauren and Michael into our house, we had no idea how much worse it could get. We'd moved into our dream home about a month ago. The house was perfect for my husband and I. 4 bedrooms, 2 baths, a basement for Roger to set his office up in, an attic to store our things in, and a large kitchen for both of us to work on our recipes and our blog. Roger and I wrote a cookbook about 5 years ago, and it's been an enormous success when paired with our cooking blog and podcast. We actually drove through this area while traveling to a nearby town where we were doing a book signing. We stopped for gas and fell in love with the community and the small town charm of Garland. The house had just become available when we started looking, and before we knew it, we were homeowners. Roger and I had just started unloading the truck when we met our new neighbors, Lauren and Michael. "Hey there, neighbors," Michael called from across the street, Lauren trailing behind him with a Pyrex dish. The dish turned out to be full of peach cobbler, and we invited them in, asking their pardon for the state of the house. "Don't worry about it. Moving is rarely a tidy event," Lauren said. The two had brought plates and forks as well, and we spent a few minutes sampling the delicious cobbler and making small talk. Michael owned the antique store in town, as it turned out, and Lauren kept their home. The two were retired, looking about 10 years older than Roger and I, and said they couldn't think of anywhere they'd rather be than Garland, Georgia. I couldn't help but gush a little over Lauren's cobbler. It was just so good. When she jokingly said that I could add it to my next book, Roger and I looked at each other a little suspiciously. Lauren looked worried for a second before she and Michael admitted that they knew who we were. "We actually met you in Gainesville during your book signing. We were pretty surprised when you moved in," Michael said, looking sheepish. I felt a little weird about it, but I put it out of my mind. They were just fans, and as our neighbors, we would undoubtedly be seeing a lot of them. Michael offered to help my husband move the boxes from the truck, and Lauren started helping me unpack the kitchen. We didn't have a lot. We tended to be somewhat frugal. But when you own a food blog, you tend to accumulate a lot of appliances. The two had the truck unloaded in a matter of hours, and as they came staggering into the kitchen, they found Lauren and I preparing a meal for them in our freshly organized kitchen. The friendship we fell into was easy, almost natural, and by the time they left for the night, we were already making plans for tomorrow. Michael and Roger had been busy, and the bedroom, the kitchen, and most of the living room were already set up when we said goodnight for the evening. We went to bed thinking how nice it was that we had made friends right away, and I told my husband that I honestly couldn't wait to see them tomorrow. That was the first night we spent in the house, and it was the first night we heard the noises. A light rain had begun to fall just as we settled in for the night. We were just getting comfortable when I could have sworn I heard a noise from the front of the house. The house is basically a long, straight line. The kitchen leads to the living room, which leads to the hallway, which leads to all 4 bedrooms and the bathroom. The acoustics are pretty good, so when I heard a door open, I opened my eyes and listened intently. All I heard was the sound of the rain at first, gentle on the roof as it fell in sheets. But as I listened, I could swear I heard the door creak. I rolled over to find Roger dead to the world, his snores sounding like a hibernating bear, and decided to go investigate. I pulled on my bathrobe and looked curiously down the hall that led to the front of the house. The nightlight cast a ghostly glow across the 4 closed doors, and I listened again to see if I could hear anything. I leaned against the doorframe, straining my ears, and jumped a little as I heard a chair scrape across the tiled floor of our kitchen. The rain was pounding now, reaching its crescendo, but I knew what I had heard, and I went back to go wake up my husband. Roger came awake like a deep-sea diver coming up for air, and sighed as he agreed to come have a look. We probably looked pretty silly as we crept up the hallway, Roger with his tennis racket and me with my walking stick. We hadn't fully unpacked yet, though, and these were all we had to hand for home defense. No one really expects to spend their first night defending their home from burglars or intruders or whatever was in our kitchen. But here we were, creeping up on someone who was rummaging around in there. We hovered at the edge of the kitchen, preparing to move in and surprise them. We charged around the corner suddenly, yelling loudly as we came, only to find an empty kitchen waiting for us. Well, the kitchen may have been empty, but it was certain that someone had been there. Every cabinet was open, every door was ajar, including the refrigerator, and the dining room chairs were stacked into a neat little pyramid on the center island of the kitchen. My husband and I spent a few minutes just looking at it before I returned to the bedroom to get my cell phone so I could snap a few pictures. It was so weird, like something from a ghost story, and at that point, I was more intrigued than afraid. I was still convinced that one of us had been sleepwalking, despite knowing we hadn't. We set everything back to rights and went back to bed, feeling too tired to give it much thought. We woke up the next morning and went about our day, completely forgetting about the night before. I was almost certain I had dreamed it before it happened again. I lay awake the next night, going over things I needed to do the next day, when I heard the squeak of a door and sat bolt upright. I kept listening, just as I'd done the night before, and heard a loud scraping sound like a chair being dragged across the floor. I reached beside the bed and grabbed hold of my wooden walking stick before trying to wake up Roger. He grumbled sleepily and told me it was nothing, rolling over to face the wall. We had both been moving furniture all day, but he had been doing the bulk of the moving and was very tired. So I got up on my own and went to inspect the kitchen. I heard the chairs scraping the tile, but they seemed to stop as I got closer to the softly lit kitchen. I came around the corner to find all the doors open, but only half the chairs stacked this time. Apparently, I had interrupted whoever it was in the middle of their work. I started to return their handiwork to its normal position, but thought better of it and decided to go check the house first. The doors were locked, same for the windows, but I had the overwhelming feeling of being watched as I moved through the house. I found myself turning rapidly, looking over my shoulder, trying to find the source of the watching. As the lights came on, though, there was nothing to see, but that feeling of being watched still persisted. I checked all the spare rooms, the bathroom, the living room, and finally back to the kitchen. It was much the way I'd left it, chairs still stacked and doors still opened. As I set about straightening things up, though, I could now hear some scuffling coming from the open basement door and turned my attention in that direction. Looking down into the dark basement, I heard something scuttling around down there. I hoped maybe it was a raccoon or a possum, but I wasn't taking any chances. I reached around the paneling and flipped the switch, hoping the light would illuminate the darkness below, but I was greeted by nothing but a dry click. I closed and locked the door, running to shake Roger awake so he could come into the basement with me. Roger came out of bed grumpily, tying a bathrobe around himself as he went to the closet to get his shotgun. He had unpacked it that day, and he joked that at least we would be ready if something showed up tonight. As I unlocked the basement door, I heard him work the pump and click the light on the barrel. He shone it into the darkness, steadying the butt against his shoulder as he too reached out to flip the lights on. He nodded when they didn't come on, and I wondered briefly if he hadn't believed me. "Stay up here. I'll yell for you to close the door and lock it and call the cops if I need to." Then he proceeded down into the basement, and I stayed upstairs, shaking like a leaf. What would I do if he actually did find someone down there? What would I do if he called up and told me to lock the door and lock him in there with that burglar? Would I have the strength to? Would I really be able to do that? After about 5 minutes, the light came on, flickering in a halting way before becoming solid and illuminating the basement. He called me down, spreading his hands wide and showing me the empty basement. If something was down here, it's gone. All I found was a blown-out bulb. I told him that I knew what I had heard, and he said he believed me, though I found myself doubting it. We went back upstairs, Roger turning off the light before going back to bed. I locked the basement door before following him, though. No sense taking chances. I spent the rest of the night in a fitful sleep and woke up the following day irritable. Michael and Laura came over again, and Laura asked me whether I had been sleeping well. Not really. Lots of odd noises in a new house, I suppose. It's not the... But she quieted and turned away, continuing to fold linens as we unpacked the sheets. The what? I asked, interested. Well, it's just... Michael and I have lived here quite a while, almost 15 years. We've seen more than one family come and go, and they all seem to have trouble with spirits, she finally said, unable to find a roundabout way to say it. I laughed, thinking she was joking, but her face remained neutral until I concluded that she wasn't kidding. You're serious, aren't you? I'm afraid so. You see, the house has a bit of a dark past. The previous 3 families have had some trouble with a presence in the home. I didn't say anything since I was hoping it might not bother you two since you didn't have any kids. What would children have to do with anything? I asked, intrigued by the information. The realtor had said nothing about deaths or disappearances in the home. They usually have to divulge that sort of thing, but she had never said anything more than that the last family had moved out rather suddenly. I suddenly thought back to the stacked chairs and the open doors and had a very serious poltergeist flashback. Well, you see, the last family moved out after their daughter went missing. We were so sorry to see them go. They were such a nice family. I asked her about them, and she said they'd been a typical family. Mother, father, a boy in high school, and a girl in elementary school. The father had worked for the local insurance agency, and the mother had been a homemaker. They had held barbecues, attended the Methodist church in town, and the children had been welcomed on the front porch for a glass of lemonade any old time. They had seemed perfectly happy, a picturesque family, and you would have never suspected the turmoil that lay below the surface. Not until the mother, good friends with Lauren, had confided in her, much as I was doing now. They lived in that house for nearly a year, when she came to me one afternoon in tears. They had been plagued for months by a presence. It moved their furniture, hid their keys and personal items, and kept them all awake at night. Her husband was getting fed up, had started stalking around the house at night like a madman, looking for the source of the noises. She was afraid he was losing it, and she didn't know what else to do. So, we helped them. You helped her? How? I asked, not understanding. Michael and I, we help people who are having trouble with the paranormal. We used to do it a lot more, but now, well, we mostly just help people locally these days. I started to ask her about it more, but Michael appeared at that moment and told her it was time they were leaving. It's nearly dinner time, and I'm sure they'd love to start settling in for the evening. Lauren nodded, but leaned in to tell me that if I needed their help, they would be glad to help us out. I slept very little the next few nights, though Roger seemed to sleep like a rock. I just kept thinking about the girl who had disappeared and what else might be happening in the house. Chairs continued to be stacked, doors continued to be opened, and no matter how many times I locked the basement door, it was always open in the morning. I continued to be awoken by scratching noises deep into the night. On our third day in the house, all the couch cushions were stacked into a pyramid. On the fourth day, something had spilled shampoo on the bathroom floor, causing Roger to slip. Roger refused to listen to any ghost talk, just figured the shampoo had slipped off the edge of the bathtub and fallen onto the floor. He sat in bed nursing his tailbone that day, and I stayed awake that night wondering what would be next. On the fifth day, we woke up to find every light bulb in the house, except for the one in our bedroom, missing. Roger called the police, knowing full well that neither of us had done this. The police came, and after checking around, they said they could find no evidence of a break-in. No locks had been tampered with, the windows were sealed, and besides the basement door, no other doors had been opened. They checked the basement, but there was nothing but a pair of sealed windows near the ground level. They found the bulbs missing there as well, but they could find nothing else missing and no sign of entry. They told us to let them know if we discovered anything else missing, but I think they believed we were playing some kind of a joke on them. We replaced the bulbs, but neither of us slept that night. That's when we were awake when the ruckus started. At 11:30, I heard a loud concussive pop as something shattered against the hallway wall. We both sat up, looking at the hallway, as another shattering crack rang out. I grabbed my stick, but my husband grabbed my arm before I could fly out into the hallway. As he grabbed and loaded his shotgun, I could hear something shattering in the living room, and I really hoped it wasn't my curio cabinet. He slung the strap over his shoulder and moved out into the hallway, barrel leading. He took 2 steps and hissed out pain. He leaned against the wall, reaching down to pull glass shards out of his foot, having come out barefoot. I was concerned for him, moving closer as my house shoes crunched on the glass, and that's when I caught my first glimpse of something. It was nothing really, just a black shape on the move, but I heard it whoosh from the living room to the kitchen, and I looked up in time to see a shadowy leg as it passed into the kitchen. This was followed by a loud crashing and a shattering of glass that sounded like bombs. Then, merciful silence as the house seemed to catch its breath. We called the police again, and they arrived to find me bandaging my husband's foot. The breaking sound turned out to be light bulbs, probably the ones we were missing, and they had been thrown all over the house. The table in the kitchen had been upended, the chairs scattered everywhere, and more bulbs had been broken on the floor. The police searched the basement again and found nothing, and the windows and doors were again checked for tampering. The police asked us many questions, and when I told them I had seen someone, they gave each other a skeptical look and asked if we needed an ambulance for my husband's foot. I had got the bleeding to stop by then and told them we were fine. As they left, I doubted we'd be able to get them out here so quickly again. As I cleaned up the glass, Roger rested in bed after I had debrided his foot. Suddenly, I heard a knock on the door. Lauren was standing in her bathrobe on the stoop, looking concerned. She had seen the police cars and was wondering what had happened. I told her that someone had been in the house. Someone had thrown light bulbs at our wall and shattered glass everywhere. Before I knew it, I was sitting on the couch and crying at this near stranger who patted my back and tried her best to comfort me. I was tired, I was afraid, and I didn't have a clue what to do. She lifted my face, and I was surprised to see her smiling. Michael told me not to offer, but I think your situation might be something we can help with. Let me help you clean up this mess. By then, Michael will be awake, and we can talk to him about the situation. That was how it started. At that point, I thought it was as bad as it could get. I believed that the sleepless nights and the discomfort of having to clean up after these restless spirits was the depth of my problem. I had no idea how bad it could be. We cleaned up, and then I slept fitfully on the couch as she dozed in the recliner. Then the sun came up, and we went to talk to Michael. That was the first time I'd ever been in Lauren's house. It was very different than I had expected. Her home was lovely, her kitchen done in a beautiful green meadow style that had happy little cows grazing and capering across the walls. She offered me coffee, and I gladly accepted it. I was still groggy from the night before, and the coffee was nice and warm and sweet. She went down into the basement, the door in the kitchen much like ours was, and left me in her placid cow kitchen for about 20 minutes. I sat, drinking coffee, basking in the cute peace of the make-believe pasture, and feeling at ease for the first time all week. It was a feeling that would not last long. She came back, walking slowly up the steep wooden steps, and stuck her head into the kitchen. "Come down into the office. Michael wants to talk about your situation." I followed her into the basement, and it was like walking into a whole different world. The basement looked like a thrift store, except thrift stores don't actually keep their items behind locked glass cases most of the time. The basement was a maze of shelves and cases, each one holding different things. I couldn't help but look around, and as I walked through the labyrinth of shelves, I saw dolls and masks and tea sets and books and all sorts of things. It was a lot to take in all at once, and I was almost glad when I found the little alcove at the end of the shelves where Michael was typing on an ancient computer. He offered me a chair and smiled at me as he invited me to tell him about my problems. With Lauren's reassurance, I began to recount the events of last week. Michael listened as I told him about the doors, the chairs, the noises, the objects being stacked, and finally, the light bulbs. He listened intently, nodding at certain points and writing down specific things. After my story was told, he asked me to tell it again. He wanted me to tell it fully, leaving out nothing, with time and dates and events. He wanted a complete picture of events so he could make a plan of attack, and it threw me a little when he said that. Attack? Attack what? Why, the spirits in your house, of course. I told it to him again, omitting nothing, and when I was done, he steepled his fingers and looked at me knowingly. "You are very fortunate to have us as neighbors. I think we can help you, but we will need to act quickly. First, I'll need some data on what sort of entity is threatening you and your husband. I think cameras placed in your home might help with that. After that, we can figure out what we'll need to cleanse the spirits from your home." He and Lauren assured me that it would be a simple matter to do this, and all that we needed was my husband's blessing. My husband, however, was not giving his blessing. "You want to let people we just met put cameras in our house because of some weirdness? I know we had a scare, but honestly, I think it's just someone messing with us. I countered, asking how they kept getting into the house. The police never found any sign of forced entry, and nothing was ever stolen. Why would someone keep coming back like that? He only shrugged from the bed, his bandaged foot still a little red. Maybe it's kids. Who knows? Maybe they know some secret way into the house. Maybe it's the realtor who had a better offer and wants to see if he can get us to sell. Hell, maybe it's some guy in a rubber mask who's trying to run us off for the mineral rights to our land. I don't know, but I do know that we haven't seen anything more paranormal than the actions of someone bored and looking to mess with the new people on the block. I was a little angry that he wasn't taking this more seriously, but I couldn't hold it against him. Roger didn't put much stock in the paranormal. If he couldn't see it or touch it, then it didn't exist to him. He could be very stubborn about these types of things too. I had hoped that seeing the events of the night before with his own eyes would help persuade him, but it appeared that he still thought this was just a trick of the living. When Lauren and Michael came over for dinner, I had hoped they would talk him into it. As Michael laid out his plan and Roger sat listening politely, all I could think about was what I had seen the night before. I needed to see what it was. I needed to see some proof of what I had witnessed. I needed to know that it had existed and that I wasn't just seeing things. I needed it bad enough to help bring their plans to fruition. Roger sat politely and listened, but in the end, he refused them, albeit kindly. No offense, Michael. You seem like a nice guy who's just trying to help, but I don't want to encourage whatever this is by putting on a show. If this is someone, then they aren't going to run us off. And if it's some ghost, they certainly aren't going to run us off. So let's just let it lay. All right, Michael? Michael only nodded, saying that if we changed our minds, he'd be happy to help us. When they took their leave, we got into a little fight over it. I told Roger what I wanted, and he explained why he didn't want to egg on whatever it was. We got a little heated, a little loud, and he finally decided to sleep on the couch, giving me the bedroom. I flopped down after getting ready for bed, wanting him here with me, but too angry to apologize just yet. Somehow, I fell asleep, and when I woke up, it was pitch black. It was the dark of the night, and I could feel someone watching me. You know when you're a kid, and you wake up thinking something's watching you? You look at that pile of clothes and see a monster, or look at the closet and see one big eye looking out at you. Well, that's what this was like. I was lying in bed, shivering a little as I broke out in a cold sweat. I glanced around, looking for the source of the peeking, when my eyes made contact with it. It was standing in the doorway. Its ghostly white face floated in the doorway. It took me a moment to pick its body out of the darkness, at first thinking the face really was floating when I finally caught the dark outline of a humanoid body. The mask wasn't the glow-in-the-dark kind you see trick-or-treaters wearing, but the smooth white porcelain of a ceremonial mask. The face on it was that of a demon, the ink swaying, grinning, and gnashing its teeth as it maintained eye contact. We held our stares for a good 20 seconds, my eyes begging my brain to make this a dream before I pealed out a long, loud scream that shook the rafters. Then the devil shot off towards the back of the house. I had expected Roger to run to see why I was screaming. To my surprise, I heard him scream as well, a bellowing roar that not quite drowned out the loud whump of something heavy impacting the floor. He came scrambling into the room a moment later, wincing with every step as he came down on his injured foot. He slammed the door, panting, and said that he was sorry for not believing me. I heard other noises going on in the house, but he just locked the door and said he believed now that we might need some help. After what I saw, I think we might need the whole damn Catholic Church. Roger told me about what he had seen in the living room, his voice still shaking. He told me how he had woken up suddenly and wasn't sure why at first. You know how you can feel something watching you sometimes? Like you don't know where it is, but you feel it watching. Well, that's what woke me up. He had come awake groggily, looking around blearily, before the source of the staring became apparent. The living room was dark, the nightlight in the kitchen casting a semi-luminescence over the room, and it took his eyes a minute to adjust. Roger said he'd thought it was his foot at first. It had been hurting before he finally dropped off, but he quickly realized that wasn't it. What had been watching him was a crouching something, its white face staring down from the coffee table that was floating off the ground. Roger said he and the thing had looked at each other for about 30 seconds before he started to scream. "His face," he said with a shudder. It was like a Rorschach picture. It moved as I looked at it. It didn't look right. It didn't move right. It was like watching one of those magnetic pictures as it falls apart, or an Etch-a-Sketch when someone shakes it. He said it ran off towards the kitchen as the table came crashing down onto the floor. Roger had run too, hearing me screaming and coming to be with me. He didn't know what they were or where they had come from, but he knew that what he had seen had scared him. I got up then, grabbing my stick and telling him that we needed to make sure that whatever it wasn't lurking around somewhere. I think I was honestly hoping that we would see it again. I wanted Roger to be sure. No second guesses when we invited Michael and Lauren to help us. We went through each of the back rooms first. We had meant to put children in those rooms, natural or adopted. However, as long as this thing was stalking the halls, that was a dream that couldn't be realized. We searched every room, Roger watching the door with his gun, as I searched under the beds and in the closets. I saw no evidence of anything being in any of them, despite seeing the creature come this way. I had just opened the closet in the last room, Roger saying how maybe we should search the bathroom, when I saw it burst out and run at me. It scared me half to death, the sight of it making me backpedal, and it shoved past Roger as it kept running. Roger was frozen for a second, the white face of the thing looking horrible. He turned as it went towards the kitchen, however, and leveled his gun as he took a shot. The gun clicked dry, though, and Roger worked the slide, finding it unloaded. He pumped it frantically, not understanding, and I came shakily to him as he struggled with the gun. It was loaded yesterday. I had seen him load it. But it was suddenly empty, and Roger only goggled at it as the back of the creature departed into the kitchen. I loaded it. It was fully loaded," he said, and he sounded as confused as I was. We came shakily into the kitchen, Roger holding the gun like a club, and found the basement door open wide. No chairs were stacked tonight, but I suppose they really hadn't had time, what was scaring the shit out of all of us. We went to check the basement, and that's where we found the shotgun shells. They were laid out neatly on a shelf in the corner. Roger touched them like he couldn't believe they were actually there. Of the demon or ghost or whatever it had been, there was nothing. We called the Schwavezes the next day. Michael and Lauren came immediately, their van out front and loaded with equipment. They started setting up, cameras at key points in the house, and all of them recording 24/7. Michael explained that the cameras would download the footage to an external server in their basement, so they wouldn't miss a thing. They set up their equipment and decided to monitor it from their basement. That way, we won't affect anything while we're recording, Michael said. Wouldn't want our presence to mess up the footage. While setting up, I noticed something on the side of one of the cameras that made Lauren jump. It was a sticker on the side of one, a white ghost coming out of the words, "Chavez's Hunts." She tried to brush it off, saying it was nothing, but when I pressed her, she sheepishly told me that most of this stuff was from a project they used to do. It was just a little something, a show on a little network that no one had probably ever heard of. We would go into people's houses, kind of like what we're doing here, and help them get the ghosts out. We nearly got picked up for syndication. A bigger network was interested, but we had a little accident, and they decided not to. An accident, I asked? Yeah, it was nothing. We bit off a little more than we could chew, I suppose. Someone's house burned down, and they were pretty mad. The network decided that we had been reckless. The insurance we had paid for the accident, but that was the end of our ghost hunting days. At least, until we moved in next door here, she added. We joked about it a little more, but I thought it was weird that she had never mentioned it. We finished setting up, and she said that she'd be going back home to check the feeds. I picked up a little, some mess having been left behind from our efforts, and found myself looking around constantly as I shuffled through the house. I felt ill at ease, the feeling of being watched now constant, and I hoped it wasn't from the cameras. When I was done cleaning up, I took the trash out and saw that the mail had run. There was a circular from the local paper, a bill from my cellular company, and a weird letter with nothing written on it. It was a plain white envelope, no address or return address, and had not been brought by the postman. I looked up and down the block like I expected to see a mysterious person hiding somewhere nearby, and brought it inside. I opened it and let a single piece of paper peek out from the top. I shook it out and found a cryptic message and more questions than answers. Meet me at Darren's Beans tomorrow at noon. I have information about the Chavezes you should know. I sat in the coffee shop, swirling my coffee and thinking about the note. Meet me at Darren's Beans tomorrow at noon. I have information about the Chavezes you should have. I'd been hesitant, not wanting to indulge in some kind of nonsense. What could this person possibly have to tell me about my new friends? Was this some kind of grudge from someone? Maybe an unhappy person they had helped? The message had shaken me, and I had started to just throw it away and not follow up on any of it. Then, the spirits had destroyed my house. We'd gone to bed, Lauren calling to let us know that Michael was monitoring the feed in case of trouble. Roger and I settled in for the night, the camera in the corner of the room silent as the grave. As we lay there, trying to sleep, Roger rolled over and wrapped his arms around me, pulling me close as we lay in bed together. Is this the right thing to do? He asked quietly. Did we make the right decision here? If they can help, why not let them? I told him. But can they help us? Roger seemed hesitant to ask it, casting his eyes over to the camera. I have to hope so, I half whispered. What other choice did we have, really? When the loud crash came from the living room, shaking Roger from his thin slumber, I knew it was the curio cabinet. We both jumped up, reaching for our weapons as we headed to the living room. There was another crash and the sound of a sofa being turned over. An eruption of glass followed it as the sofa went through the glass-top coffee table, and we put on a burst of speed as we came into the wreckage of the living room. We looked around, stunned at the carnage, broken glass and wood fragments littering the carpet. I saw Roger turn his gun about as he looked for the source of the destruction. He still didn't seem to grasp that there would be no one here to shoot, no one here to use that shotgun on, and he panned about as if he were looking for someone to blame this mess on. I could see my curio cabinet, which I had been using to display my first cookbook and some awards we had won, lying on its front, glass everywhere. I took a step towards it, but my husband put a hand out to stop me. I don't know what brought it on, but it's probably the reason I'm not in the hospital. A second or two after he stuck his arm out, the window exploded in a shower of glass, breaking inward as if someone had been outside throwing rocks. We turned, thinking it had come from the kitchen, as Roger and I looked behind us. The kitchen was in a state. The cabinet doors were open, the stove yawned blankly, and the refrigerator light had been taken. This left the inside a dark hole that gaped wickedly with secret knowledge. As we looked around, our eyes kept going back to the basement. The door was open, and the light wouldn't turn on when we flicked the switch. We had just taken a step down, Roger's gun light illuminating a small area below, when a loud crash came from the back of the house. We ran, closing the basement door behind us, and charged into the hallway. The second door on the right was open, one of the unused rooms. The boxes we'd been storing in there had been pushed over. Their contents was strewn everywhere, pictures, receipts, everything, but there was no sign of any presence. The room was empty, except for the boxes, and now it was nothing but a fallen mess of cardboard and odds and ends. This continued for about an hour. Something broke the windows in the front of the house. Something pushed the mattress off our bed and shattered the mirror on my vanity. Something stacked the chairs onto the kitchen table in a vaguely mystic pattern. Something broke the door off the stove. Something smashed the toilet, leaving it spewing onto the linoleum. Something kicked the door to the basement open, putting a hole in the wall. They led us from one side of the house to the other, never slowing, never tiring. It was like there was an army of them, and they had the destruction of our house on their mind. No sooner would we investigate some new destruction than we would hear something else being wrecked in a different part of the house. Just as we were running to see what had happened in the back of the house, there was a frantic knock at the door, and I suddenly remembered that we were on camera. Where had our protectors been this whole time? Were they watching us, waiting for something really terrible to happen? It was Michael, and he was out of breath as a big Polaroid swung around his neck. "Sorry, I dozed off for a minute and woke up to see you guys dashing around." I started to tell him what was happening, but a sudden crash came from the bathroom. We ran down the hall to find the toilet spewing water. Something had cracked the bowl, spilling it into the floor where it lay in a puddle of water. We heard a scrambling in the hallway, like someone walking on all fours, and stuck our heads out just in time to see a pair of dark feet head around the corner into the kitchen. Michael snapped a Polaroid of it, quick fast, and as the shutter flashed, there was a hellish clatter from the kitchen as the table was flipped over. We came into the kitchen, though, to find it empty. I didn't sleep that night. We spent the night fixing, cleaning, and doing as much for our poor house as we could. Lauren came over about 2 hours later, saying she had gone down to keep watch and found Michael gone, and the house they were supposed to be monitoring a mess. The windows were beyond repair, the stove door as well, but we picked up the things that had been knocked over and cleaned up the mess that we could. My curio cabinet was pretty well trashed, but I picked it up and knocked the jagged glass out, putting the things back in and making it look nice. The Chavezes left about 10 o'clock, saying they wanted to go over the footage and see if they could get a good look at the entity. "I'm sorry to say, but this is the clearest I've ever seen one of those spirits," Michael said. Roger waited till they were gone before he kissed me on the cheek and said he had somewhere he needed to be. He would be back later, he said, and that's when I registered what he was wearing. He had dug out one of his nicer suits, something I hadn't seen him wear since my parents drug us to Easter Sunday service. When I commented on it, he said it was nothing and quickly excused himself as he left for business. With the empty, haunted house to myself, I decided to be early for my mysterious informant. I arrived at the coffee shop around 11 and had finished 2 cups before a woman in a gray business skirt walked in and looked around. Her hair was pulled back in a bun, her glasses were black and thick, and she looked as if she was someone's secretary. She spotted me and walked over briskly. The barista asked if she wanted anything, and she told her a usual and sat down. She introduced herself as Trudy Fogarty, the city's librarian. "I'm sorry for the secrecy, but I don't want to seem like I'm trying to implicate anyone. She seemed to be searching for the right words. "I know you and your husband are new in town, and I don't want you to get taken advantage of." She spread out 3 small books, a ledger, a scrapbook, and a child's journal, complete with a Lisa Frank unicorn on the cover. The Chavezes have lived in this town for the last 15 years. They had been investigating an old mill in the area when they found Garland, and they fell in love with the area. Like you, I suppose. What did they tell you about their lives before they came here? I told her that Lauren had told us they were ghost hunters, who'd had a show on public access. Lauren had downplayed the importance of this show, but I had suspected that it might have been bigger than she let on. With the gear that they owned and the basement full of trophies, I suspected that they had been a great deal larger than she let on. I told Miss Fogarty this, and she nodded. They were local celebrities, traveled around Georgia as they hunted ghosts and found strange little artifacts. No doubt you've been in their basement. Nearly half the town, all told, has been down there to have a peek in the 2 decades they've lived here. I told her that Lauren had said their ghost hunting days were over, and in the end, they had moved to Garland. She scoffed loudly. I was a fan of their show. It was more entertaining than many of the shows on network television, mostly because those 2 were getting footage of actual entities. They captured footage of levitating objects. They caught entities that wrote messages on walls that appeared out of nowhere before the viewer's eyes. They caught actual footage of many of the things they were hunting, and people ate it up. When they moved here, many of us were ecstatic until Henderson's Antiques burned down. She opened the ledger and showed me a group of numbers, many written in red, that didn't make much sense to me. Henderson had called them because he had a spirit in his store. He had taken on some new stock from a recently deceased widow over in Helen, and his store had suddenly become very active. There was movement after hours. People saw things through the window, and it was only a matter of time before Chavez's haunts got involved. They set up some cameras, caught some evidence, and suddenly wanted to perform a cleansing after hours. "That's what they're about to do in my house, too," I said. "Well, it all went wrong. Somehow the store burned down, and they lost everything. Suddenly their show was pulled. Their dreams of stardom were dashed, and all because of the Hendersons. The Hendersons who happened to be their neighbors. What happened to them? I asked, a little startled. They started having trouble at home, things happening in the night, items going missing, and the Hendersons swore it was the same thing that had happened in their store. He came to get some books on ghost hunting, and he looked frazzled. I asked him why he didn't just get the Chavezes to help, and he told me that they hadn't spoken to them since the fire. Their dreams had ended, and they were sour about it. The Hendersons spent the next 3 months trying to get rid of the spirits in their house. They had priests out, other ghost hunters, inspectors to make sure it wasn't just some bad wiring or something, and a circus of others, but nothing seemed to work. She took a sip of something that smelled strongly of hazelnut before looking at me over her glasses. Then, they just disappeared into the night, never to be heard from again. She pointed at the ledger. Come to find out, Mr. Henderson was in quite a bit of debt, and the insurance money from the shop, as well as the money from the Chavez's insurance that they'd had to pay out after the accident, settled all his debts. Most people just think maybe he had enough of being haunted and left, but I always kind of thought it was odd. When the Chavez's suddenly opened an antique store of their own, I started looking a little bit closer. She took out the scrapbook then, and I saw it was full of pictures of my house. A few of them featured smiling families that looked semi-professional. Others were just candid shots of the home. A few of them had the Chavez's white van in the front yard, and they looked to have been taken years apart. She had clearly been keeping this scrapbook for quite some time. Did you know, she asked, that the last 4 families, including the Hendersons, have all just up and left in the middle of the night? Each family reported trouble with spirits, the last one almost the day after they moved in. When did you and your husband start noticing the activity, if you don't mind me asking? I told her, and she only nodded. After the Hendersons came the Greens. They were a young couple, 1 child on the way, and they were excited about having their first home. The occurrences didn't start until after the baby was born, and even then, not until 3 or 4 months afterwards. They left a month after the first incident. After then came the Dents. They had 2 kids and a dog. They reported that someone had killed their dog after just a week in the house, and the strange activity started the next week. The Dents didn't live in that house a month, and then one day, they were just gone. The farmers came after them. They lived there for almost 3 years before anything weird happened. In their case, they just might not have noticed, though. The farmers were old people, and their children, a girl and 2 boys, were teenagers and prone to staying out late. A month after their daughter saw an apparition in her bedroom, though, they were gone too. The Wests came last, a mother, father, and 2 kids. They lived there for about a year before things really started to happen. Then one day, their daughter Lucy went missing, and suddenly they were very vocal about ghosts and spirits in the house. They said it had been going on from almost day 1, but they felt silly telling anyone about it. The police didn't believe them, but the Chavezes sure did. A month later, they too just up and left. I told her that this was fascinating, but I wanted to know what this had to do with the Chavezes. None of them ever left any forwarding addresses. No one has ever heard from any of them again. Hell, no one's even sold that house, and no check has ever been sent to anyone. It always forecloses when the payments stop coming. They have never cropped up on a census since leaving this town, and no one who has known them has ever seen them again. The Wests had no family. The Hendersons didn't have any that would talk to me, but the Greens were very interested in the whereabouts of their son and daughter-in-law. I've heard of people going into hiding after they experience a supernatural occurrence, but all 4 families? That doesn't seem likely. I asked her, a little hotly, what she was insinuating, which seemed to surprise her. I was having trouble keeping the anger out of my voice, her words sounding more and more like an accusation. The Chavezes have been more than kind to us throughout our whole experience, and this woman I didn't even know, frankly, was making a lot of assumptions. The Chavezes were my friends, something that wouldn't seem weird to me until later, and I was not going to sit here and let her talk badly about them. I told her so, and decided that I had heard enough after she tried to convince me yet again of her information. I got up to go, but she caught my hand, and I looked down. She had opened the journal and begged me to look at the entry. I've been the librarian for the Garland Public Library for nearly 30 years. It's not glamorous work, but I love it, and research is what I do with my time. I stumbled across this in the children's area, not long after the Wests had left. Someone had laid it beside a shelf in the Storytime area. After someone else had stacked books on it, no one had noticed it for a while. I was cleaning up when I found it and realized that it was Lucy West's journal. Her mother was a school teacher, and Lucy was a precocious child who already knew how to read and write by the time she entered kindergarten. I saw her keeping that journal for almost a year, and it was rare to see her without it. I had a feeling that she hadn't been sleeping very well lately, and that was the reason that she left it behind. Most of it's nothing, childish ramblings, but, well, just have a look at this entry. She opened it to a page with a half-scrawled date and a picture of a brown-haired girl in a blue dress. I saw a girl playing in Miss Lauren's backyard today. She said her name was Stacy, and she looked scared when I saw her. She's older than me, but she still said she wanted to play. We talked through the fence some, and I said I'd try to see if I could come over and play sometime. There were a few more of these, and they painted a strange picture of the Chavezes. Mommy says that Miss Lauren says she doesn't have a little girl, but maybe I can play with her niece when she comes to visit again. I hope it's soon. I want to play with her again. Stacy's spending the night this week, and Miss Lauren says that we can play in the backyard. Stacy told me her name isn't really Stacy today, but I think she was just kidding. I tried to get Miss Lauren to let Stacy come to the library with me, but she said she wasn't allowed. Stacy and me are going to have a sleepover tonight. I'm so excited. Then there was a final entry, this one looking scrawled instead of written, and I could see tear marks on the page. I haven't seen Stacy since our sleepover. Miss Lauren sent me home early saying I made Stacy upset. I didn't even do anything. Stacy just started crying and said she missed her mommy and daddy. I told her to call them. Then she cried and cried. I tried to take her to the phone so she could call them, but Miss Lauren caught us and told me to never do that again. She yelled a lot, and my mom was mad when she took me home. They yelled at each other some, and now I don't think I can play with Stacy anymore. I read over the childish scrawl and shrugged, asking what this had to do with anything. Lucy West lived in your house. She disappeared not long after this sleepover. What's more, the Chavezes don't have a niece, as far as I can tell. They're both only children, and since they both don't have any children of their own, who was it that Lucy was playing with? I set the book down and told her it didn't matter. I was leaving. I was tired of hearing my friends badmouthed by this nosy librarian. She tried to call me back, but I was already heading for the door. I was upset, and whether I wanted to admit it or not, I was a little shaken by all this new information. The Chavezes were good people. They had tried to do nothing but help their neighbors. So they had left. They couldn't handle it, and maybe they hadn't given the Chavezes enough time to get the job done. I had cranked my car and was pulling out when she knocked on my window, her face so pleading and worried that I found myself rolling my window down to spite myself. Look, I'm not asking you to believe me right away. I'm just telling you that, in the case of all 4 disappearances, the Chavezes are the only constant other than the spirits. Just be careful, and be safe. I told Valerie West the same thing as she stormed out of this parking lot 4 years ago. You don't have any children to lose, but I don't want you to lose your lives either. Valerie, Lucy's mother, was my friend, and I don't want to think of what might have happened to her happening to someone else. I didn't say anything. I just pulled out of the parking lot and went back home. I had a lot to think about after that. I arrive home to find a small circus on my front lawn. Michael and Roger were arguing. Lauren would interject every now and again, but was being roundly ignored by the 2 men. Roger was clearly getting angry, and Michael was red-faced as he waved his hands in indignation. I sat for a count of 30, watching the 2 of them argue, before getting out and approaching the trio. Michael and Roger looked at me as I approached, and both seemed like they wanted to start shouting again when I asked them what was going on. Michael, however, was a little quicker on the draw. Your husband called a priest from St. DeMarco's and asked him to bless the house. I was silent for a moment before asking him what the problem was. Michael looked at me as if I were an utter fool. We've only just started our investigation. You have to give us enough time to complete it so we can get rid of the... No disrespect, Michael, Roger cut him off abruptly, but I mostly just watched you run around my house with a camera last night. This is the second night in a row I have watched creatures beyond my control destroy my house. With all due respect, I'm taking this to the professionals. Michael looked affronted. Looked like he meant to say more, but in the end, all he could do was shake his head. Have it your way, but don't say I didn't warn you. You aren't the first family to think they could take the easy way out of this and regret it. The pair of them went tromping across the lawn, Lauren looking back as they came to the street. She seemed to want to say more, and when she turned, Michael reached for her. Lauren shrugged him off and rounded on the pair of us hotly. She spoke to both of us, but her eyes bore into me, leading me to believe her message was directed my way. We are probably the only two who can stop this. You'll learn that, though it may be too late by then. Roger and I waited for them to leave before going into the house. We walked right into another fight. Why didn't you tell me you'd called a priest? He was up on a stepladder, taking down the cameras and putting them in a box. That had been his first task after changing clothes. He seemed to relish having them gone. He was being careful, but you could tell that he really didn't want to be. I had no idea what Michael had said to him before I got there, what they had said to each other, but it seemed like their friendship had probably ended. I had seen him like this a few times since we'd gotten married, and it was how he got right before he prepared to shut down. It seemed weird to have been so mad just half an hour before now. I spent almost an hour defending these two people, these two complete strangers, and at the time, it had seemed so natural. They were my friends, and I couldn't let her talk about them like that. Now, from the lens of an hour in the future, it seemed odd to have so vehemently defended people who were basically strangers to me. Maybe Valerie West had felt this way after a certain sleepover, I thought. Like you consulted me before you went to the Chavez's? He asked. I wanted to get mad, but he had a point. Since when do you put stock in religion anyway? Like I've said before, Michael was never particularly spiritual. He had been raised Baptist, but he hadn't been to church since my parents dragged him up to Easter service a few years ago. He always talks sarcastically about overly religious people, and he was the last person I would have thought would go talk to a priest about his problems. When I mentioned this, he only shrugged. Well, in all the movies, they always call a priest to get the spooks out, right? I laughed, I couldn't help it, and asked him why he really contacted a priest. Well, he said, I went to the library to try to get some information about the house. This was after you suggested bringing in the Chavez's, but before we saw the creatures. You were sleeping off the night before, and I decided to try and see if anything like this had ever happened in the house before. At the time, I was seeing if the house had ever appeared in the local news. I was hoping for an easy answer, some mineral deposit beneath the house, or naughty kids who'd harassed the previous owners. But it turned out that the house had been empty for quite some time before we moved in. It had, however, made the papers for a disappearance. A previous owner had lost a daughter, the West family. When I asked the librarian if they had any more information about the disappearances in the house, she got very interested. My blood ran cold. Did she have glasses? Hair in a bun? Roger nodded. Yeah, have you met her? She recommended that I call Father Dominic and get him to bless the house. She said that a friend of hers had called him, but something had happened before she could make an appointment with him. Valerie West? I asked, and he turned on the stepladder and fixed me with a strange look. Yeah, how did you know that? I told him about what the librarian had told me. I told him about the ledgers, the scrapbook, the journal. I told him about the families that lived here before us, the fire at the antique store, the Hendersons, the Greens, the Dents, the Wests, the whole sad story. He came down off his stepladder and listened to me as I spilled the whole thing out. I felt bad at the end for getting mad about him seeing a priest. After all, I Certainly hadn't told him about my meeting today, had I? When is he coming? The priest, I mean, I asked sheepishly. Friday. Father Dominic said he needed to take a few days to get some things together. He's apparently never performed an exorcism before. Go figure. We spent the rest of the day taking down the cameras and loading them into a box. I could imagine the Chavezes seething next door as we cut their camera feeds. We were careful not to damage any of their equipment, and when we were finished, Michael took them and put them on their front porch. He rang the bell and left, but they were still there when he got back to the front porch. As upsetting as it was to have our budding friendship dashed, it was kind of a relief to have the cameras out of the house. When the sun came up, though, I found myself wishing we had just left them in. Maybe someone would have seen what happened that night. We were in the bedroom, getting ready for bed when it happened. We'd eaten our dinner in the kitchen, discussing how we would have to start working on next week's entry to the blog if we wanted to afford our bills. We had put our blog and cooking podcast on 2-week hiatus when we moved, but our allotted time was quickly running out. As the sun went down, however, we found ourselves looking around expectantly. The house had grown eyes, and we both felt constantly watched, cameras or no. We moved our plans into the living room, but that still didn't feel safe enough. Eventually, we were sitting in bed, going over plans for what we would do tomorrow. We had just finished a rough draft of the article we would post on Wednesday when something shoved our refrigerator down. I know this because I found it turned over the following day at the bottom of a mess. I lunged off the bed, running for the bedroom door so I could close it against any intrusions. I had just reached it when I saw the hall light go out, bathing the hall in a ghostly glow. Suddenly, the white demonic face swam out of it and ran for the door. I slammed it with all my might and leaned against it as it began to rattle and buck in the frame. Out in the house, things were being destroyed. It sounded as though every piece of furniture was being flipped. Every item was being knocked or thrown to the ground. The clamor was so loud, I thought they might have pulled the cabinets off the walls. Roger went to the closet, but couldn't find his shotgun. I reminded him that it probably wouldn't do us much good unless it shot holy water, and he came back to brace the door with me as something battered at it. We both leaned there for what seemed like days, until suddenly, it stopped. We both slumped against the door, tired and sore as our adrenaline began to taper off. Roger suddenly rocketed forward, though, as something split the door from the back. His head was bloody, and I could see gleaming metal as an axe head stuck through the front of the door. We retreated to the bathroom then, and shoved the cabinet we had beside the door in front of it. The sounds of the bedroom being ransacked were heartbreaking, and I'm not ashamed to say that most of my night was spent crying in the bathtub. Roger put a towel against his head, the cut little more than a scalp wound, and he put his back against the sturdy old cabinet. They rattled the door, slammed it, chopped at it, but the cabinet held fast, and they soon gave it up so they could go back to destroying the house. We sat huddled in the bathroom, listening to it all go on, and clutching each other for comfort. Then, after what must have been hours, there was merciful silence. We sat, listening to the silence like scared deer. Roger had just gotten up to check the bathroom door when something loud hit the front door. Roger staggered back to the bathtub, where I had been sitting with my knees against my chest. The house was full of incomprehensible yelling and the sounds of boots heading up the hallway. What the hell was this? This wasn't the same as before. This was different. And as it came closer to our hiding place, I buried my face against Roger's chest and begged whoever was listening for this to stop. When the police kicked in our bathroom door, guns drawn, I thought both of us might have a heart attack. One of my neighbors had called the police, it would seem, and they had actually shown up. The police said they had suspected it was a domestic, but the state of the house made them think burglary when they first saw it. They said things had been moving in the house when they first arrived, but a search of the house had turned up nothing. They searched it again, an ambulance coming to check us out, and as we sat on the back bumper of the ambulance, I told Roger that he might want to call the priest and see if he could come tomorrow instead. He agreed. The next night, Father Dominic stepped into our house with all the pomp and circumstance of a cardinal. He was dressed as one would expect a priest to be. He wore a long tan coat over his priestly vestments. When he hung it up, I could see the long black robe I had expected. His head was shaved, gleaming like the guy on the cleaner bottle, and his collar was starched and crisp. He carried a small satchel with him, and he looked around dubiously when we invited him in. Whatever they were had destroyed the shambles of our home. The kitchen was mostly clean now, but the cabinets still gaped open, and the fridge made a weird sputtery noise now. The living room carpet still crunched a little with glass, and the night air came right in through the windows that had been broken 2 nights ago. We offered him tea as he looked at the destruction, and he said that would be lovely. As he drank, he went room to room and looked at the chaos. "Are you certain that this is the work of malicious spirits?" he asked. Roger and I only looked at each other and shrugged. "I ask because I have felt no malicious energy in your house. It feels clean, if you'll pardon the expression. I will be more than happy to bless your home, but I wonder if it will have any effect at all." He opened his satchel and took out a stole, which he looped about his neck. He had also brought a vial of holy water, Roger having informed him of our problems at length, and a piece of the host, which he kept in a dish. He also had a crucifix and a well-worn Bible, just in case, he said. He moved through the house, blessing it and the inhabitants in the name of God the Father, and calling for his protection, and on and on and on. As a lapsed Baptist, I didn't follow all of it, but I got the gist. He finished in the kitchen, the focal point it seemed, and he asked us to clasp hands with him as he prayed. He had barely begun when the lights went out and we were left in near total darkness. The priest stuttered over his prayers momentarily, but picked up the threads masterfully. He continued to pray, inviting us to pray with him, and as the prayer swelled, I could feel our space being invaded by the familiar presence. I peeked, opening my eyes a little, and jumped as I noticed a pair of masked entities not far away. I blinked. I had expected there to be one, but there were 2. One was definitely bulkier than the other, but they both stood near 15 feet away and stared at us through the eyes of those white porcelain masks. The priest and Roger had their eyes shut, deep in prayer, and that's why they missed the 2 figures as they stood watching our little powwow. That's why they missed it when they ran at us, knives coming out. I cried out, backing away from the table, and that was all that saved my life. The 2 of them vaulted the table and leapt at Roger and the priest. Both went down in total surprise as the pair rode them to the ground. The priest's stole went from purple to red as the dark creature stabbed him viciously. He shouted, brandishing the cross at them, but it did no good. Roger lay dazed, his head having hit the wall when he fell, and I took a step towards him as I tried to help him, the creature still worrying at the priest. When Roger sat up, clutching his bleeding head, however, it seemed to catch the attention of the smaller one. It jumped on him, knife cutting his throat in a single practiced slice, and I backed away in horror as the other turned towards him, having finished with the bloody priest. Roger looked at me, confused and dazed, as the blood ran down his shirt. As the larger one joined in, the knife came down, and I saw it take Roger through the heart and drop him to the wall, twitching. I'm not proud of it, but I did the only thing I could think to do in that situation. I ran. I wasn't looking where I was going, though, and I hit the basement door, which was still wide open from the night before. When I stepped to the side, startled by the collision, I fell down the steps into the inky blackness of the basement. I was confused when I came to, my head hurting and my body aching. I didn't know how long I had been out, but one look up the stairs brought me back to reality. I saw the bulky spirit framed in the near blackness above, staring down at me as I sat in a pool of light from the basement window. His white face was the only thing truly visible, its features shifting and changing. The knife it held glinted wetly as it dripped onto the wooden stairs. I cringed as he took one slow step towards me. It began to walk down the steps in a slow, horror movie fashion, and I tried to make my body move so I could escape whatever this lumbering horror was. I pulled myself further into the basement, trying to hide under the dark stairs as the heavy footsteps of my pursuer came steadily down. How could its steps be so loud? Spirits didn't make noise. Not like this. I kept dragging myself, kept trying to escape, kept trying to find some magic portal to help me flee from this impossible situation. When my hand fell on the smooth metal handle of the shotgun, I felt some small amount of reassurance. It was useless, though. It was a weapon of the real world, but I suddenly felt powerful as I held it. I heard a step behind me and rolled to see him not 6 steps away from me. I leveled the shotgun at the creature, but his face registered nothing but the same ghastly commitment. He took a step, and I wrapped my finger around the trigger. If I was going to die, I would die with the sound of thunder in my ears. The gun flashed, lighting up the basement, and by that flash, I could see a giant hole as it appeared in the side of the spirit. It toppled to the ground, clutching its side, its mask stained red as something coughed and wheezed beneath it. I sat up, wanting to reach out and grab that mask and reveal whoever had been the cause of my torment. I forgot this when I heard steps bounding on the kitchen floor upstairs, pounding towards the basement. I looked around, trying to find an escape, and my eyes fell on the open closet to my left. I scuttled into it painfully, closing the door as whatever was coming down the stairs slid into the dark space and wailed its otherworldly wail. I peeked out, looking to see the other creature bent over the first. The one I had shot was not moving, and the second seemed to be mourning it as it bent next to it. I backed away from the door as it turned to look for me, knowing now that I was trapped. I had the gun, but who knew if it had actually ended the first one? I expected my back to strike the wall of the closet as I moved backwards, and I was surprised when it never happened. I was backing through a newly formed hole in the wall of my basement closet. A door seemingly opened there by magic. When my back finally hit the new wall, I saw that it was indeed a doorway. A door sitting open, which had swung out of a tunnel. Even in my fear, I found myself looking at the door, seeing that, when closed, it would fit flush against the wood, almost disappearing. I swung it shut, closing it softly, when I heard someone scuttling around near my hiding spot. I was left with nothing but the dark tunnel. I clicked the light on the shotgun barrel. Now, with the immediate danger outside, I used it to search the door for a lock or a bolt. I found a big rusty slide bolt on the back, and it looked like it would be capable of keeping out a small army. I drew it closed, hopefully locking the spirit inside the house, and turned the light deeper into the tunnel. I saw a path leading away from my basement and into the unknown. It seemed to be my only option, so I took it. I limped for about 5 minutes, the small light my only means of sight in the pitch-black tunnel. The floor was smooth, the walls were concrete, and it seemed to be a straight shot to wherever it led. Putting my hand on the leftmost wall, I walked carefully towards whatever lay at the end. I pulled my fingers back suddenly, as they came into contact with something that was not smooth stone. My fingers had slid over wood and metal, and I realized I had found a door. I moved the light from the gun barrel down to the door and looked at the lock. It was old, thick, and intricate wood, carved with patterns. It looked very out of place in this dark space. The lock was old and rusty, just as the other one had been, and as I put my hand out to open it, I heard a loud banging from down the tunnel. I spun, holding the light up, and saw the door bucking wildly as something slammed against it. I ran the bolt and opened the other door, slamming it shut behind me as I shot a similar bolt on the other side. The light on the shotgun flickered ominously as the bolt slid shut, and I was left in pure darkness. I worked the slide like I had seen Roger do 100 times, and was unsurprised to find the gun empty. I set it down, its usefulness at an end, and walked out into the small dark room beyond. I told myself it was because it was heavy, but I'm not sure that was it. I was shell-shocked, having just shot a thing and watched my husband die, still hurting from falling down the stairs and probably suffering from a concussion. Honestly, it was probably lucky it was empty, so I didn't just slide it into my mouth and join him. Whatever the reason, that's where I left it. I walked into the dim room, lots of cluttered shapes casting bulky silhouettes in the near permadarkness. The space was utterly devoid of light, or so I thought. As I moved in, bumping against something and spilling it to the ground, I saw a small sliver of light under a door near the back. I moved carefully, my eyes adjusting to the dark a little, tracking towards the light near the back of the room. The depths of the room are almost impenetrable, but I can make out the line of the door as I come closer, the light getting brighter and more pervasive beyond it. Suddenly, something made my skin crawl, my mind feeling eyes on me. I turned my head, slowly, cartoonishly, to the side, and nearly jumped as I saw a white face looking back at me. The mask and I maintained eye contact for a count of 10, and I felt my eyes watering as the staring contest went on and on. It just stood there, glaring at me from eye level, and if it were going to hurt me, I wished it would and just get it over with. It didn't move. It didn't stir. It only stood in silent observation of my fear and kept its eyes trained on me. We stood like duelists, preparing for one of us to make the opening cut so the other could parry and deliver the killing blow. After nearly a minute with no movement, I slitted my eyes and tried to make out the features of a body beneath it. The others had always had bodies beneath them, but this one had none of the form the others seemed to possess. I found myself moving forward, hands out like a blind man, and hesitated before my hands could find the edges of the delicate mask. I lifted it up, only then realizing it was attached to a stand, and not a person. I looked into its featureless eyes for a few seconds, nearly hypnotized by its frightening visage, before setting it down and moving back towards the door. The door was locked, but the key was hanging next to it, and it fit smoothly into the lock. I put my ear against it before opening it, hesitating after I heard muffled voices on the other side. I could hear someone talking, and the muffled return of another voice. They had heard the key, and were probably wondering who it was who had come to torment them. I still had no clue where I was, the crack of light doing little to illuminate the room, and if I was going to get out of here, I would need their light to do it. I pulled the door open and found the last thing I expected, a pair of half-grown teenagers hiding beneath a single bed. The room was childish, to say the least. Posters on the wall depicted cartoon characters I'd never heard of. A toy chest with stuffed animals and some battered toys poking out of the unoccupied corner. The floor was concrete, but it was covered in threadbare rugs, and the walls were painted drywall that looked like a kid's vision of a cloudy sky. I found myself staring at those clouds for a few minutes. Where had I seen those before? One of the girls moved hesitantly, and it stole my attention. She was about 11 or 12, her long dark hair hanging lank over her eyes. The other was blonde, her hair hacked very short, and she looked at me fearfully like I might be a monster. She was older, 16 or 15 maybe, but she looked even more afraid than the other girl. While the blonde girl cowered beside her bed, the dark-haired girl crept forward, looking at me like a wild animal who wants to eat your offered food but is afraid of the consequences. She came within 3 feet of me when a metallic turning noise from the corner made her scamper away to hide. I looked up at the source and felt my blood run cold. It was a camera, a simple silver box on a guided arm that turned and purred easily. As it turned back towards the door, I couldn't help but notice the sticker on the side of the camera. A very familiar sticker. When a loud crash came from the next room, I glanced back out into the darkness before looking back at the girls as they huddled in terror. No chance to hide in here, I thought, and stepped back out into the pitch-black room on the other side of the door. I could hear someone coming down the stairs, their footsteps agitated as they came. I ducked behind the ghostly shelves, trying to hide, but my stealth was negated a moment later when the bright overhead lights came to life. Suddenly, I knew exactly where I was. I was crouched amidst shelves that nearly toppled under the weight of countless trinkets. Trinkets. That was the wrong word, though. I had realized that these were no trinkets, just as the soft steps came tentatively into the basement. These were trophies, prizes taken from past conquests. As I sat huddled amongst their treasure trove, I began to hold my knees as I tried not to shake apart. The facts were all coming together now, and the realization shook me deeply. The footsteps came closer, the soft steps of someone much smaller than the one I had shot. I had let them into my house. I had invited them into my home. I had welcomed them in as friends. They had eaten at our table, smiled and laughed at our stories, and then they had come by night to torment us. Why? Why had they done this? My husband was likely dead, my dream home now an abattoir, and I was kneeling in the belly of the beast as I waited for the last of my tormentors to find and kill me. When Lauren spoke, I shuddered hard enough to rattle my teeth. "I know you're here. Why not just come out and make this easier?" Lauren's voice was a patchwork of barely contained rage. She was trying for her usual cheery tone, but her voice had a jagged quality that spoke of barbed hooks just waiting to be uncovered. I suspected now, strongly suspected, that I had shot Michael, having blown a hole in him as big as my fist. I was also pretty certain he was dead. Lauren had come to finish the job, to clean up the witness, and I was her prime objective now. She would find me, and unarmed, I wouldn't be able to put up much of a fight. I could hear her bare feet smacking the concrete not 2 rows away. I looked up at the shelf desperately, trying to find something heavy to use as a weapon. I didn't dare move. If I made so much as a squeak, she would have me. I saw a doll with a half-burnt face, a sewing needle in a glass holder, a lamp with a heavy base, a wicker picnic basket, and more clutter than my eyes could work through right then. I thought about the wicker basket, but my eyes kept coming back to the lamp. "I will find you," she sing-songed, her feet still making that little pop noise as they came. The lamp was what I settled on. It was heavy enough to knock her out and probably block that knife if she tried to swing it at me. I cursed myself for not bringing the gun that was less than 20 feet away and empty. It might as well have been on the freaking moon, though, at this point. It would do no good to wish it were here now, though, and so I wrapped my hands around the narrow dip near the base and prepared to swing it. She was at the end of the aisle now, and I could see her shadow. That's when she noticed the door I had left open, and all thoughts of finding me fled from her. She gasped, a metallic clatter echoing off the floor as she ran for the open door. My lack of foresight had just saved my life. I took a better grip on the lamp and made my way quietly towards the door. At first, I thought I might just close the door and lock her in there. Then I could simply head upstairs and call the police in her soothing cow kitchen. They could come and take her away, and I could get back to mourning my husband and the complete upheaval of my life. I just prayed she didn't have a key so she couldn't immediately come running after me after I slammed it shut. My plan evaporated, though, when I heard her talking to one of the girls. "Was she here? Tell me, Gracie, was she here?" Gracie did not seem to want to answer her, and I heard the sound of a hand slapping flesh. "Tell me, Gracie, was she here? Leave her alone. She doesn't know anything, okay? Just..." The angry sound of someone being pushed followed this, and someone cried out in pain. "Shut up, Lucy! I should have never brought you into our family. You've been nothing but a spoiled..." But I never found out exactly what the girl had been. Lauren started coughing then, and the cough sounded wet and raw. She cursed, continuing to cough, and I peeked around the corner to see what was going on. I saw Lauren backing away from the younger of the 2 girls, the girl stalking after her with a steak knife held out in front. Lauren was clutching her stomach, and I could see the red staining her fingers as she looked for an escape. Her eyes fell on the door, and then onto me. Her eyes were twin orbs of hate, and I knew what I had to do before she took a single step. I slammed the door and heard the mechanism click as something hit the other side. Lauren banged on the door, kicking and screaming as I walked towards the stairs. She had stopped, however, before I got halfway up. The police showed up in a hurry, when I told them I had 4 bodies and a pair of kidnapped girls. They found me sitting in the tranquil cow kitchen with a cup of coffee and a shell-shocked look that gave them little doubt of who I was. The next few hours were a blur. The girls and I were rescued. The bodies of Michael, Roger, and the priest were taken from my house. Lauren's body was taken from the basement as well, which didn't surprise me. If I had been the one with the knife, I'd have likely done the same thing. I had watched her cut Roger's throat, destroy my house, and then threaten to kill me as well. Watching her get wheeled out under a sheet was really no skin off my nose. The girls and I were taken to the police station, where we were separated and questioned about the night before. I told the police the full story. I told them how I had met the Chavezes when we moved into our new home. I told them about the start of our ghost activity. I told them how the Chavezes had offered to help. I told them about my meeting with the librarian. I told them about the priest, the murders, how I had killed Michael Chavez in my basement when he attacked me. I mostly muttered about how I had followed the tunnel into the basement and found the girls. They left me alone after that. They left me for what felt like hours. I sat in the little room and felt numbness wash over me. It was the sort of thing you feel right before a heavy depression sets in. When I lost my grandmother, we were very close. I felt something like this. The longer I sat, the more I came to realize that I was alone now. I would never see Roger again, at least not alive. I would probably never return to that home, the home I had wanted so much. Even if I did, all I would see was him dying every time I went in the kitchen, see us cowering in the bathtub every time I went to use the bathroom, or see myself killing Michael every time I went into the basement for something. The house was tainted, my husband was dead, and I was as alone as I was now. I jumped when the door opened, 1,000 years later, startled out of my depression. A plainclothes officer walked into the little room with a file folder under his arm. He looked at me and was surprised, spinning his chair around as he sat across from me, shaking his head in disbelief. We just looked at each other for a few minutes before he finally expressed the source of his disbelief. I gotta say, you're probably the luckiest person I've ever seen. I asked him what he based that on, and he answered by setting the folder on the table and opening it. Because, as far as we know, Michael and Lauren Chavez have a body count in the double digits. He told me about it, though he prefaced it by saying he probably shouldn't. The parts of the story I wasn't aware of, at least. The 2 girls, as I suspected, had been Grace Henderson and Lucy West. Grace had been taken from the Hendersons' home after the pair had killed them. Their motives were not crystal clear, but the detective believed it was revenge. The Hendersons had long been suspected of creating the fire that had burned down their shop and framing the Chavezes for it. Mr. Henderson had owed a lot of money to debtors, and the lawsuit had cleared almost all of his debt and left him in the black. The Hendersons had been their enemies, but killing Grace, a girl of 4, was probably a step too far for Lauren. Why? I asked, not sure how he could put anything past them. Lauren Chavez, you see, is barren. She was incapable of having children. She had received this news not long before they took the Henderson job, and the idea of simply taking what she had been denied was appealing to her. They kept Grace in their basement until she became used to the arrangement, and then started letting her out a little bit. That was when Lucy West saw her. Lucy West had been taken for the same reason, he suspected, and they were also the reason for the murders. Michael Chavez likely had no interest in kids, but Lauren wanted a big family. She had often told her friends that she had been an only child, and that she had always thought it would be nice to have a house full of children to curb her loneliness. Killing the people who lived in that house was a means by which she could take more children. She took the Greens baby after they were dead. Of this we have little doubt. The fact that you didn't find him in the basement, too, likely means it died without its mother. So they kept killing, Lauren persuading Michael to help her so they could keep collecting footage, so they could get back in the spotlight. You and your husband had no children, so you were of no use to them. Thus, they had to get you out of the way. It all seemed to buzz around my head like a swarm of angry bees, but after some time, I think I've finally come to terms with the events of Garland, Georgia. I've moved on now. Roger's death was 5 years ago in August, and I only write this now to get it out of my mind. I decided to write a new book, a different book, a book about my experiences in that house. My old agent thinks it will sell. Paranormal thrillers often do, and he thinks that the touch of realism will help it sell. I laugh every time he says, a touch of realism. For me, those events were all too real.